I thought it might be interesting to do some reading. Here I have this shelf that I got at the Globe Bookstore when they closed their Pioneer Square location and retreated to their university place. What I picked up today is this copy of Speculations by T.E. Hulme. It's edited by Herbert Reed with a foreword by Jacob Epstein, Harvest Books, originally $1.45. Part of Essays on Humanism and the Philosophy of Art. I gathered this today and I thought it was pretty good, and I started to read it. It kind of begins this way. After the contents, it was first published in 1924, is a foreword. Hulme was my very great friend, and what I can say about him is entirely personal. What appealed to me particularly in him was the vigor and sincerity of his thought. He was capable of kicking a theory as well as a man downstairs when the occasion demanded. I always felt him to be my chief bulwark against malicious criticism. He was a man who had no regard for personal fame or notoriety, and he considered his work lay entirely in the future. His whole life was a preparation for the task of interpretation which he had set himself. He would make reckless sacrifices to possess works of art which he could not really afford. He bought not only my own works, but also those of Gaudier Brzeska, and this long before Gaudier was well known. Hulme was a terror to fumists and charlatans of all kinds. His passion for the truth was uncontrolled. I recall dozens of little personal things characteristic of the man, but particularly our first meeting. I was at work on the Wild Monument. Hulme immediately put his own construction on my work, turned it into some theory of projectiles. My sculpture only served to start the train of his thought. Abstract art had an extraordinary attraction for him. His own brain worked in that way. One time, in company with a group of imagists, he composed some short poems with which, had he gone on, he would have made what would be called a literary success. But this seemed to him too facile. Like Plato and Socrates, he drew the intellectual youth of his time around him. We have no one quite like him in England today. Jacob Epstein. Introduction. Thomas Ernest Hulme was born on the 16th September 1883 at Gratton Hall, Endon, North Staffordshire. He was educated at the high school Newcastle-under-Lyme and at St. John's College, Cambridge. In March 1904, he was sent down from Cambridge, along with other undergraduates, for indulging in a brawl. He spent the next 2 years in London studying in accordance with his own inclinations. In July 1906, he went to Canada, where he stayed 3 months. He returned to England for a few weeks, and early in 1907 he went to Brussels, where for 7 months he taught English and learned French and German. When he came back to London, he began definitely to study those subjects on which his interest was settling. In April of 1911, he attended the Philosophical Congress at Bologna. He stayed in Italy, traveling for about 3 months. Early in 1912, he sought to return to Cambridge, and he was readmitted largely through the intervention of Professor Bergson, whose letter of recommendation on that occasion is some indication of the impression Hulme was already creating. Je me fais un plaisir de certifier que je considère mon sœur T. Hulme comme un esprit d'une grande valeur. Il apporte à l'étude des questions philosophiques de rare qualité de finesse, de vigueur et de pénétration. Je me trompe beaucoup, il est destiné à produire des œuvres intéressantes et importantes dans le domaine de la philosophie en général, et plus particulièrement peut-être dans celui dans la philosophie de l'art. Hulme's temperament was not one that could submit readily to an academic mold, and his university career was never completed in an orderly sense of the word. He left Cambridge shortly after his return and proceeded to Berlin, staying there for 9 months and acquiring a wide knowledge of German philosophy and psychology. He then settled for a while in London, where his forceful personality and witty conversation began to form a group and to influence a generation. Then came the war. Hulme joined the Honorable Artillery Company and went to France shortly after Christmas 1914. He was wounded during the spring of 1915, and upon recovery he was gazetted to the Royal Marine Artillery. He returned to the front late in 1915 and was killed near Newport in the 28th of September 1917. Hulme was a militarist by faith and acted upon his beliefs with a rare enthusiasm. Many notes devoted to the technical problems of artillery practice and to strategy in general testified to his serious interest, and the military notes contributed to the New Age and the Cambridge Magazine under the nom de guerre of North Staffs during 1915 and 1916. He gave an intellectual defense of the militarist ideology, which caused surprise not only to the militarists, to whom it was as strange as it might be deemed unnecessary, but also to the pacifists, who had regarded themselves as constituting a close corporation of the intelligentsia. Meanwhile, Hulme had not desisted from his more strictly intellectual pursuits. In 1913, he had published in a translation Bergson's Introduction to Metaphysics, and in 1916 appeared Sorel's Reflections on Violence, translated by Hulme with a critical introduction. These 2 volumes, apart from the complete poetic works of T.E. Hulme, 5 poems printed in 1915 as addendum to Mr. Ezra Pound's reposts, and apart from various articles contributed to periodicals, make up the sum of Hulme's published work. He left behind him a great mass of notebooks and manuscripts from which the present volume has been selected. From a notebook on notebooks, which is among the material, it's possible to reconstruct something of Hulme's aims and methods of work. His plan was to keep, 1, a daybook, which he always carried with him, and into which he entered every thought or observation as it occurred to him. 2. A corpus, into which as much of the daybook as on second sight seemed worthy was to be entered, this to be indexed. 3. When a general idea began to emerge from the accumulation of notes, then a new notebook or file was to be opened, and all ideas that could be subsumed under that general idea were to be transferred. 4. From this notebook, the final work would be written. Unfortunately, this notebook on notebooks shows signs of being one of the last things written by Hulme, and certainly the system was never put into complete operation. What existed when I began to edit his papers was a collection of hundreds of loose notes, varying in size from pieces of paper no bigger than a postage stamp to complete folios of notes on one subject. Many of the notes had already been written up as articles in the New Age, others had been made the subject of lectures, the majority are mere indications of thoughts, keywords, and key phrases. But certain general ideas did exist, and at least 6 works of series works were taking shape. These were 1. Modern Theories of Art, see Appendix B. 2. A General Introduction to the Philosophy of Bergson. 3. A book on Jacob Epstein and the Aesthetics of Sculpture. 4. A book on expression and style, the psychology of literature. 5. A series of pamphlets on anti-humanism, anti-romanticism, and pre-Renaissance philosophy. 6. A philosophy or Weltanschauung in an allegorical form. Towards the first book, there existed in manuscript various notes on modern aesthetics and the essay on Bergson's theory of art, now published. The basis for the second book has been formed as a series of 4 lectures on the philosophy of Bergson, which were delivered in London during 1913. From the notes used for these lectures, it has been possible to piece together the essay now printed as The Philosophy of Intensive Manifolds. The book on Jacob Epstein was in an advanced state of preparation at the time of Hulme's death, but the manuscripts perished with him. Of the more original works he was engaged on, the book on expression and style only exists in the form of rudimentary notes, mere indications to the author of a train of thought associated with some image or expression. The series of pamphlets was planned rather than executed. No doubt the essays were printed as humanism and the religious attitude, and romanticism and classicism would have been issued in the series, which was, however, to be a complete critical examination of Renaissance ideologies and the rehabilitation of pre-Renaissance philosophy. There are indications of its trend and scope in the introduction to Sorel's Reflections on Violence, reprinted as Appendix A. Lastly, there was the work to which Hulme devoted most of his thought and which he kept constantly in view. This was to be a personal philosophy cast into an allegorical form, perhaps analogous to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and having as its final object the destruction of the idea that the world has unity or anything can be described in words. The notes for this book stretch over a considerable period, perhaps 10 or 15 years, and are constantly rewritten and amended. They're never given any final form, and apart from the name Afra, who is to be the central figure, nothing of the allegorical structure can be discerned. The more coherent fragments have been gathered together in this volume under Hulme's own title, Cinders. To attempt any exposition of the speculations now thrown to the lions does not fall within my province. More than is usual in such writings, they speak for themselves. If Hulme had one foe exposed before all others to his consistent invective, it was obscurantism. He was not by design a systematic thinker. He was, in one sense at least, a poet. He preferred to see things on the emotional light of a metaphor rather than to reach reality through scientific analysis. Significance is nonetheless real. He knew very certainly that we are at the end of a way of thought that had prevailed for 400 years, and this, in his premonition of a more absolute philosophy of life, he had advanced the ideals of a new generation. I wish to express my thanks to Mrs. Kibblewhite and Miss Pattinson, who have supplied me with biographical material and helped me in other ways, to Mr. A.R. Orridge, with whose assistance I began the work of editing, and to Messrs. George Allen and Unwin for permission to reprint an introduction to Sorel's Reflections on Violence. Herbert Reed, 1924. Note to the second edition. In this new edition, I've corrected a few misprints. In 1925, I published notes on language and style referred to on page 14 in the Criterion, volume 3, page 45. Later, they appeared as a pamphlet, University of Washington Chapbooks, number 25, Seattle, 1929. It is not likely that any other material remains to be published. Herbert Reed. So, preface to the author follows, a preface by the author, rather. The history of the philosophers we know, but who will write the history of the philosophic amateurs and readers? Who will tell us of the circulation of Descartes, who read the book and who understood it? Or do philosophers like the mythical people on the island take in each other's washing? Are they the only readers of each other's books? For I take it, a man who understands philosophy is inevitably irritated into writing it. Few who have learnt the jargon must repay themselves by employing it. A new philosophy is not like a new religion, a thing to be merely thankful for and accepted mutely by the faithful. It's more of the nature of food thrown to the lions. The pleasure lies in the fact that it can be devoured. It is food for the critics and all readers of philosophy, and I suppose are critics, and not faithful ones waiting for the new gospel. With this preface, I offer my new kind of food to tickle the palate of the connoisseurs. Humanism and the religious attitude, he begins. Humanism and the religious attitude, a method. One of the main achievements of the 19th century was the elaboration and universal application of the principles of continuity. The destruction of this conception is, on the contrary, an urgent necessity of the present. Originally urged only by the few, it has spread, implicit in the popular conception of evolution, till it has attained the status of a category. We now absorb it unconsciously from an environment already completely soaked in it, so that regard it not as a principle in the light of which certain regions of fact can be conveniently ordered, but as an inevitable constituent of reality itself. When any fact seems to contradict this principle, we are inclined to deny that the fact really exists. We constantly tend to think that the discontinuities in nature are only apparent, and that a fuller investigation would reveal the underlying continuity. This shrinking from a gap or jump in nature has developed to a degree which paralyzes any objective perception, and prejudices our seeing things as they really are. For an objective view of reality, one must make use of both of the categories of continuity and discontinuity. Our principal concern then at the present moment should be the reestablishment of the temporary disposition of mind which can look at a gap or chasm without shuddering. I'm not concerned in these notes, however, with gaps in nature in the narrow sense of the word. I'm thinking rather of general theories about the nature of reality. One of the results of the temper of mind I have just discussed is that any general theories of this kind which assert the existence of absolute gaps between one region of reality and another are at once almost instinctively felt to be inadmissible. Now, the method of criticism I wish to employ here is based on the fact that most of the errors in certain subjects spring from an almost instinctive attempt on our part to gloze over and disguise a particular discontinuity in the nature of reality. It was then necessary, first of all, to deal with the source of this instinctive behavior by pointing out the arbitrary character of the principle of continuity. What is this method? It is only possible here to describe it quite abstractly, leaving the details till later. Certain regions of reality differ not relatively but absolutely. There exists between them a real discontinuity. As the mind looks on discontinuity with horror, it has attempted to exhibit these opposite things as differing only in degree, as if there is in reality a continuous scale leading from one to the other. From this springs a whole mass of confused thinking in religion and ethics. If we first of all form a clear conception of the nature of a discontinuity, of a chasm, and form in ourselves the temper of mind which can support this opposition without irritation, we shall then have in our hands an instrument which may shatter all this confused thinking and enable us to form accurate ideas on these subjects. In this way, a flood of light may be thrown on old controversies. Necessary preliminary to this, however, must be some account of the nature of the particular absolute discontinuity that I want to use. In order to simplify matters, it may be useful here to give the exposition a kind of geometrical character. Let us assume that reality is divided into three regions, separated from one another by absolute divisions by real discontinuities. 1, the inorganic world of mathematical and physical science. 2, the organic world, dealt with by biology, psychology, and history. And 3, the world of ethical and religious values. Imagine these three regions as three zones marked out on a flat surface by two concentric circles. The outer zone is the world of physics, the inner that of religion and ethics, the intermediate one that of life. The outer and inner regions have certain characteristics in common. They have both an absolute character, and knowledge about them can legitimately be called absolute knowledge. The intermediate region of life is, on the other hand, essentially relative. It is dealt with by loose sciences like biology, psychology, and history. A muddy mixed zone then lies between two absolutes. To make the image a more faithful representation, one would have to imagine the extreme zones partaking of the perfection of geometrical figures, while the middle zone was covered with some confused, muddy substance. I'm afraid I shall have to abandon this model, for to make it represent faithfully what I want, I shall have to add a further complication. There must be an absolute division between each of the three regions, a kind of chasm. There must be no continuity, no bridge leading from one to the other. It is these discontinuities that I want to discuss here. A convenient way of realizing the nature of these divisions is to consider the movement away from materialism at the end of the 19th century. In the middle period of the century, the predominant popular view entirely ignored the division between the inner and outer zones and tended to treat them as one. There was no separating chasm, and the two were muddled together. Vital phenomena were only extremely complicated forms of mechanical change. See also Spencer's biology and the entirely mechanical view involved in the definition of life as adaptation to environment. Then you get the movement represented in very different ways by Nietzsche, Dilthey, and Bergson, which clearly recognize the chasm between the two worlds of life and matter. Vital events are not completely determined and mechanical. It will always be impossible to describe them completely in terms of the laws of physics. This was not merely a local reaction against a local false doctrine. It contained an original element. The movement made the immense step forward involved in treating life, almost for the first time, as a unity, as something positive, a kind of stream overflowing, or at any rate not entirely enclosed in the boundaries of the physical and spatial world. In dein Auge schaute ich, o Leben, etc. So far, so good. But the same movement that recognizes the existence of the first absolute chasm between the physical and the vital proceeds to ignore the second, that between biology and the ethical religious values. Having made the immense step away from materialism, it believes itself adequately equipped for a statement of all the ideal values. It does not distinguish different levels of the non-material. All that is non-material must it thinks to be vital. The momentum of its escape from mechanism carries it on to the attempt to restate the whole of religion in terms of vitalism. This is ridiculous. Biology is not theology, nor can God be defined in terms of life or progress. Modernism entirely misunderstands the nature of religion. but the last 20 years have produced masses of writing on this basis, and as far as thought today is not materialistic, it tends to be exclusively of this kind. It is easy to understand why the absolute division between the inorganic and the organic is so much more easily recognized in the second division, for the first falls easily into line with humanism, while the second breaks the whole Renaissance tradition. It is necessary, however, that the second absolute difference should also be understood. It is necessary to realize that there is an absolute and not a relative difference between humanism, which we can take to be the highest expression of the vital, and the religious spirit. The divine is not life at its intensest. It contains, in a way, an almost anti-vital element, quite different, of course, from the non-vital character of the outside physical region. Questions of original sin, of chastity, of the motives behind Buddhism, etc., all part of the very essence of the religious spirits, are quite incomprehensible for humanism. The difference is seen perhaps most obviously in art. In the Renaissance, there were many pictures with religious subjects, but no religious art in the proper sense of the word. All the emotions expressed are perfectly human ones. Those who choose to think that religious emotion is only the highest form of the emotions that fall inside the humanist ideology may call this religious art, but they will be wrong. When the intensity of the religious attitude finds proper expression in art, then you get a very different result. Such expression springs not from a delight in life, but from a feeling for certain absolute values which are entirely independent of vital things. The disgust with the trivial and accidental characteristics of living shapes the searching after an austerity, a monumental stability and permanence, a perfection and rigidity which vital things can never have, leads to the use of forms which can almost be called geometrical. See also Byzantine, Egyptian, and early Greek art. If we think of physical sciences as represented by geometry, then instead of saying that the modern progress away from materialism has been from physics through vitalism to the absolute values of religion, we might say that it is from geometry through life and back to geometry. It certainly seems as if the extreme regions had resemblances not shared by the middle region. This is because they are both in different ways absolute. We can repeat this in a more summary form. Two sets of errors spring from the attempt to treat different regions of reality as if they were alike. One, the attempt to introduce the absolute of mathematical physics into the essentially relative middle zone of life leads to the mechanistic view of the world. Two, the attempt to explain the absolute of religious and ethical values in terms of the categories appropriate to the essentially relative and non-absolute vital zone leads to the entire misunderstanding of those values, and to the creation of a series of mixed or bastard phenomena which shall be the subject of these notes. See also romanticism in literature, relativism in ethics, idealism in philosophy, and modernism in religion. To say that these bastard phenomena are the result of the shrinking from discontinuity would be an entirely inadequate account of the matter. They spring from a more positive sense, the inability of the prevailing ideology to understand the nature of this absolute. But they are certainly shaped by this instinctive effort to dig away at the edges of the precipice, which really separates two regions of reality until it is transformed into a slope leading gradually from one to the other. Romanticism, for example, confuses both human and divine things by not clearly separating them. The main thing with which can be reproached is that it blurs the clear outlines of human relations, whether in political thought or in the literary treatment of sex, by introducing in them the perfection that properly belongs to the non-human. The method I wish to pursue then is this. In dealing with these confused phenomena, to hold the real nature of the absolute discontinuity between vital and religious things constantly before the mind, and thus to clearly separate these things which are in reality separate. I believe this to be a very fertile method, and that it is possible by using it not only to destroy all these bastard phenomena, but also to recover the real significance of many things which it seems absolutely impossible for the modern mind to understand. This closing this first section, first 10 pages or so. So Hulme is sort of a Wittgensteinian of sorts. Now, Wittgenstein has stood up as kind of an anti-Plato, where Plato is kind of about the supreme purity and beauty of monism and pure logic and such things, whereas Wittgenstein, after the Tractatus Logico Philosophus, where he establishes a very strong logic, he then turns around in the Brown and Blue books to demand that his free will intercedes itself and thus provides free will. As that Wittgenstein is free to have free will and as well free to defend others' rights to have it, which is one of the reasons Wittgenstein is really held up strongly in the world of logic and philosophy, not so much because he's an adherent of logic and philosophy, but he very much demands intercession on an individual's behalf of himself, the ability to have free will. Now, as a monist in my theism, I pretty much have that it already exists, because whether it does or doesn't, it does. And then in so regards to something like Descartes, and I think therefore I am, and this and that, there's just yet that he thinks that he is. So anyway, some of these other books, they have a kind of a common theme, I suppose. There's something about the continuum and meaning and some study of the postmodern, which could be modern again if it weren't so torn apart. That then we'll talk some more later, hopefully, about these. And I hope that you'd enjoy this reading and and that the globe has spun around a few times on its little solar dial, and next to the shell and the shelf that I got from Globe Bookstore. Good afternoon.